This, of course, is our amazing planet. It's home to, we don't really know, perhaps 5, maybe as many as 10 million species of animal and plant clinging to the surface of this rock hurtling through space. For all we know, it may be the only life in the universe. We don't yet know. But it's extraordinary. It gives us food and water and clean air, and it's a source of beauty and inspiration. It gives us everything. And so I find it bizarre and inexplicable that we're treating it with such a lack of respect, that we're doing such terrible damage to our planet. Climate change, of course, is perhaps one of the best known issues. The climate is in danger of becoming a runaway process in the near future. And that gets a lot of media attention, but that's just one issue. There are many others, things like soil erosion, pollution of our soils and our rivers and our air and our seas with plastics and heavy metals and pesticides and fertilizers and so on and so on. And we're over harvesting the fish, we're damaging the coral reefs and so on and so on. My real focus of interest is on the loss of biodiversity, on the loss of wildlife from around the planet and its consequences for us. Now, when I talk about biodiversity, most people expect me to then start talking about extinction events and the conservation of large charismatic animals, things like rhinos perhaps, or tigers or whatever. But of course, as you know, my focus is on insects. And I think until very recently, we'd overlooked the declines going on in smaller creatures, the creatures that we pay less attention to, but which are actually possibly more important than the rhinoceros and tigers and so on in terms of what they do. So I've just put up a graph which shows you trends in the daily catch of the weight of insects caught per day on German nature reserves in things called malaise traps. So top right is a malaise trap. It's a funny looking thing. It looks a bit like a tent. But it catches flying insects, and the chart, and German entomologists have been putting these traps up since the late 1980s and catching insects. And they've been doing this on nature reserves scattered all across Germany. And the chart shows you something really remarkable and terrifying. So you can see that between 1989 and 2014, the weight of insects caught dramatically fell. It fell by about 75% in 26 years. It seems that 3/4 of the flying insects in Germany disappeared. Now, that's become a very well-known study, but I could show you many others that corroborate this, that show that it isn't just Germany where this is happening. It seems to be, so far as we know, a global phenomenon, that insects are disappearing really fast. And that should be of massive concern to people for a number of reasons. Insects themselves make up the bulk of life on Earth. We've so far named about 1.5 million species of animal and plant on our planet. And of that 1.5 million, about 1 million are insects. So they make up the bulk of life on Earth. But then they're food for a very large number of the other species. For example, most birds eat insects, as do bats and lizards and frogs and toads and freshwater fish and so on. So if the insects disappear, that means the food is disappearing for all these other creatures that perhaps we might care about more. But they also do lots of other things too. They're natural enemies of crop pests, so they help to keep pests under control. They recycle dead bodies and dead trees and cowpats, and they help to keep the soil healthy. They do umpteen other things, perhaps the best known of which is their pollinators. And this is one of the things that insects do that most people are aware of. Insect pollination is necessary for fruit production, for seed production. In 87% of all the plant species in the world need pollinating by some kind of insect. Often a bee. Bees are famous for their pollination, but it may also be by a hoverfly or a beetle or a wasp or a moth or a butterfly. There are thousands of species of pollinating insect out there, all doing this vitally important job. So as well as pollinating wild plants, they pollinate our crops. 3/4 of all the crop varieties grown by people around the world need pollinating by some kind of insect. And we've become used to this amazing bounty of food, of fruits and vegetables from all over the world that are stacked up on the shelves in our supermarkets for 12 months of the year. And we now take this for granted. But if we were to take away the pollinating insects, things wouldn't look so good. Most of that produce wouldn't be there. We wouldn't have tomatoes or blueberries or raspberries or strawberries or cherries or apples or chili peppers or even things like coffee and chocolate. We wouldn't have any of these things. Life would be terrible without insects. And so we really do need to look after them. This was perhaps best put by an American scientist called Ed Wilson. And I'll just read out this quote because I think it sums it up nicely. He basically said, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. In other words, if people disappeared, the planet would be just fine without us. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And he was absolutely right. So we need to look after our insects better, and we need to be deeply concerned about these rapid declines. If we're going to fix these problems, we need to understand what's driven them, why insects are declining. This is a complicated subject, and I haven't got time to go into it in depth, but there are a number of causes, particularly the loss of habitats, loss of flower-rich meadows, which we were just hearing about. Europe used to have vast extents of beautiful flower-rich meadows, most of which were swept away. So here, for example, is a surviving flower-rich grassland in Scotland. I can give you some figures for the UK. We used to have about 7 million hectares of this kind of habitat in Britain 100 years ago. But we destroyed 98% of it in the 20th century. And replaced it with habitats more like that. Industrial farming, the industrialization of farming over the last 100 years has had enormous impacts on biodiversity. And I think you can make a pretty strong argument that it simply isn't sustainable to carry on down that route of farming, because it's wiping out biodiversity, it's damaging the soil, it's polluting the atmosphere, and so on and so on. But it's certainly been a big driver of insect declines. Now, a key part of this industrial farming system is the use of pesticides. Farmers have become routinely now use enormous numbers of pesticides. We've collected data from local farmers. Sorry, this is a terribly complicated kind of calendar of pesticides and fertilizer applications by a farmer. This is just an example of one field. This is an oilseed rape field in the UK, a crop that was sown in August 2012 and harvested in June 2013. And the yellow boxes show you the different chemicals applied to that one crop. There are 20 different pesticides were applied to that one crop, including 5 different types of insecticide, along with a whole bunch of fungicides and molluscicides and herbicides and fertilizers. It's little wonder there aren't many insects living in our farmland if fields are being treated over and over again with chemicals which are designed to poison insects. It isn't just farmers that use them. To my dismay, every garden centre, every supermarket these days, every DIY shop sells a bewildering array of pesticides for anybody to buy and spray around in their garden, which inevitably does great harm to insect life. And in fact, even if you're an organic gardener, even if you wouldn't dream of buying a pesticide and spraying it in your garden, you may be accidentally poisoning the insects in your garden by buying bee-friendly plants from your local garden centre. Now, you might think I've gone mad at this point. What am I talking about? Well, so we did some research recently in my lab at the University of Sussex. We went to local garden centres, these big chains, companies that operate across the UK, and we bought the plants that were labelled being bee or butterfly or pollinator friendly. It's a common practice now in garden centres because people want to encourage insects in their gardens. And we screen them for pesticides, and to cut a long story short, 75% of the bee-friendly plants on sale in garden centres contained insecticides designed to kill insects. So people, well-meaning people going to buy plants to make their gardens a haven for insects may actually be poisoning their insects, which is really sad. So that's a very brief run through why insects are declining. There's more to it, but that'll have to do for today. It's basically this combination of factors that we've destroyed most of their habitat, we've removed most of the flowers, and we've exposed them to lots of pesticides. So what can we do about it? Well, the good news is there is an awful lot we can do. Many of these big conservation stories, people feel a bit helpless because you know, it's what can you do about the ice caps melting and the polar bears having nowhere to live, or the rainforest being chopped down. It's really difficult as an individual to affect that. But insects live all around us. They live in our gardens, they live in our parks. And so small things that we can individually do actually can make a visible, appreciable difference. And so I think there's a huge potential to turn our urban areas into oases of life, into a network of nature reserves. There's a lot of appetite for this. I've already mentioned how people are keen to buy plants to encourage pollinators. In the UK, we have 500,000 hectares of gardens. That's a bigger area than all of our nature reserves put together. And just imagine if most or all of those gardens were wildlife friendly, were insect friendly. And better still, if local authorities, councils managed parks and cemeteries and road verges and roundabouts to make them wildlife friendly too, to create this enormous network of habitat running across Europe, that would just be fantastic. And I think it's a real opportunity that we need to capitalize on. I've written a book about basically how we can make our gardens wilder and support more insects in them, should you be interested. But the highlights of the book are coming up now, essentially. So how do you make your garden more insect friendly? Well, fairly obviously, if you want your garden to be a haven for insects, if you want to invite insects in to live with you and your family in your garden, then don't spray them with insecticides. That's pretty obvious, but it's amazing how many people do. You don't need them in a garden setting. We absolutely do not need pesticides. I personally think all pesticides should be banned for garden use. They've done it in France. If France can do it, why can't everywhere else? Secondly, something else you shouldn't do, or do less of, is reduce the amount of mowing you do. Lawns are terribly popular. In the UK, we love our lawns. Many people try to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis court style stripy lawn. But if you just stop mowing for a little while, it's amazing how many flowers spring up. This is my lawn, and I haven't sown any wildflowers. It's just what came up when I stopped mowing, and it's full of bees. So next time you get the urge to mow your lawn, if you just kind of calm down, make yourself a coffee or a gin and tonic and sit down and relax and appreciate the beauty of the flowers and the sound and sight of insects visiting them. Choose the right kinds of flowers to grow in your garden. All flowers originally evolved to attract insects, but by tinkering with them, plant breeders have made some flowers unattractive to insects. And this is a classic example. On the left is a classic kind of ornamental rose. On the right is more of a wild type rose. The one on the right is really attractive to insects. They love it. But the one on the left doesn't attract insects because it's a mutant. It's a mutant in which the anthers, the little orange bits in the center that are producing the pollen, have mutated into extra petals. And so it produces no pollen, and in any way an insect can't get into it. So the one on the left is basically, from a bee's perspective, an abomination. We should avoid double flowers and other intensively bred flowers, like this kind of thing. You might think these look beautiful. I think they're hideous. These are often called annual bedding plants. We should get rid of this kind of nonsense and instead grow more traditional cottage garden, old-fashioned varieties of plants, herbs and so on, which are really easy to grow, and they just attract swarms of insects. There's lots more information in my book and on my YouTube videos, should you be interested to find out more about what plants to grow in your garden to make it a feast for insect life. You could also encourage wildflowers and be more relaxed about weeds. So the word weed is something we made up. It's a concept of plants that we've decided are in the wrong place, but very often they're beautiful native wildflowers. So perhaps the single best tip I can give you is you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden, just like that, by renaming them wildflowers. It just takes a bit of imagination. So don't spend your life trying to eradicate weeds, which actually are beautiful and attractive to insects, things like this dandelion here. One small further thing we might encourage people to do in their gardens is to put up a bee hotel. These are great projects for kids to get involved with. They provide homes for certain types of solitary bee that like to nest in narrow horizontal tubes, and they're easy to make with a drill and a piece of wood or bits of bamboo or whatever. And a couple of the bee species you might attract are shown there on the right. As I say, they're easy to make, and again, I've made a YouTube video people can look at. Or you can buy them, and there are some commercial designs of bee hotel where you can look inside and see what's happening in the tubes, and they're really cool. They're great for public engagement, great for engaging kids and interesting them in insects. So here on the left you can see the bee hotel with a sort of door on the side, and on the right you can see the little piles of bright yellow pollen which were collected by the mother, and little grubs along the top there, which are baby bees eating the pollen, each separated by a little mud wall. This is a bee called the mason bee, which is one of the common occupants of bee hotels. Okay, so that's a very quick run through about things we could do in urban areas to make them more wildlife friendly. To return to the big picture and our beautiful planet, it really concerns me that the next generation, if we continue on our current course, our children are going to inherit a world that's lost most of its resources and most of its natural beauty. And I always find it really odd that people would do anything for their children apart from leave them a decent planet to live on. Isn't that ridiculous? We must do better, and we can do better, but maybe a great place to start is by looking after the insects that live all around us in our gardens. Thank you.